Hello, World Lit 1 class. This is Dr. Kramer, and I am making a short video here to kind of talk you through the process for essay number 2, which is a researched literary analysis. This paper is what is due after the break, and I'm just going to pull it up here. Again, this is kind of what I would give you if you were in person and we were talking, and so it's just going to be very informal as I talk you through it and not as formal as my other videos. Okay, so some things I noticed with essay number 1, you had some good observations and some really good use of quotes in general. The major things that got people down were a lack of a true thesis, and then if they had a thesis, or if you had a thesis, sometimes you didn't carry that through to each body paragraph with topic sentences, and also sometimes people weren't using the text itself enough to, kind of bolster their points. So let's talk about this research literary analysis, which is going to be like your first essay, just with secondary sources. After I go through these slides, which are more about structure, then I'm going to show you an example paper, and then we're going to look at the parameters for this particular assignment. Okay, so what a research literary analysis should do as a paper. It should make an argument about what a piece of literature means. It is an interpretation work, all right? And so this seems weird maybe to some people if you're not used to writing these kinds of papers. Some people write literary analysis papers in high school, or you might have written one in Composition 1 or Composition 2. The difference between like a high school paper, especially, and this one, is that I'm going to ask you to make an argument and not just observations. You will need to include close readings and explanations. Some of you did a really nice job on this for the first essay. And then you want to fold in secondary sources for several reasons. Historical context, if you need that to help make your point, interpretation backup, okay? And then if you want to argue against someone, that's perfectly fine. These are just other people interpreting the work for themselves, and so you can argue against them. That's perfectly all right. Okay, things that you don't want to do, however, in a literary analysis is summarize the work. You will have to use summary in some places, but you're going to use it very sparingly. You're not just going to regurgitate what happens in the work. You should not be a book report of other people's views or of the background information. This is really the difficulty when you start bringing in secondary sources, is that sometimes you lose your own argument. And so that's what I mean by don't just be a book report. You don't also or either want to be just a description of the literary techniques used. And this is something that some of you fell into with essay number 1. You want to talk about what they mean. Now, are you still going to describe the literary techniques used? Of course. But instead of just saying, hey, there's this metaphor that compares love to a donut or something, just you can tell I'm hungry, that just randomly made one up. You want to talk about what that means. Well, what does it mean? What's the argument? If love is a donut, there's a hole inside. Does that mean, and that it's a donut and not something more substantial in terms of nutrition? You want to push on that metaphor and make an argument. And so you want to say, Jennifer Kramer uses a donut metaphor in her poem, Life is Just Dessert, in order to argue that love or romance is sugary and sweet and fun, but ultimately hollow, or something like that. Okay, so that's just to pull something completely out of the air, but that's an example of making an argument. And then I would go and describe, okay, well, let's talk about this metaphor or talk about this characterization, and let's really push on it. That would be description, but it would be in the service of my argument. Now, something that we need to be careful on, if you choose to look at a religious work, which is perfectly fine, they are full of literary techniques, and that's why I've assigned them. We don't want to drift into life application or applied theology on the religious texts. So it's perfectly fine to talk about the Sermon on the Mount per se, and talk about its use of metaphor or its use of parables. But we want to make a literary argument and not a theological argument. And the difference would be something like, and that means I should, be nicer to my next door neighbor or something like that. I mean, that's an example of how you could drift into life application. Keep the focus on the literary aspects. Okay, Most of you could use some work on your introductions. This is typically something that students feel unsure about. They feel cheesy writing them. This isn't a composition class, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to construct an introduction that will actually be doing work for the paper instead of just holding space. Okay, make sure that you have an arguable thesis first. You cannot write an introduction without an arguable thesis. It is okay in a college paper for the humanities, which this is, to actually use the phrase, "I argue that," in front of your thesis. Sometimes if you will phrase your thesis in this way, it will force you into a more argumentative instead of observational stance. We want to avoid vague words or phrases like expresses or sends a message in our thesis because we want to be more specific. So you don't want to say, Kramer's poem, "Life is a Dessert," expresses the idea of love through a donut metaphor. I mean, that doesn't really tell me anything, right? You want to use more specific verbs there. For example, you could say criticizes, or you could tell what the message actually is instead of telling the reader that the work is sending a message, okay? In a literary analysis essay, your thesis should be the last sentence in your first paragraph for a shorter paper. So this last assignment in this class, the last essay, is considered a short essay, even though it may feel like it's long. If you ever have to write, say, a 20-page essay, then you just scale up everything. So for a 20-page essay, you might actually have a 2 or 3 paragraph introduction, and your thesis would go at the end of that introduction section. Okay, but in a short paper, like for this class, we're just going to put it at the end of the first paragraph. Then we want to work backwards from our thesis in constructing our introduction. So I want to draw the readers in with a hook. I want to explain the usual or surface level reading of the text, which is called the shared context, and then I want to problematize it. If I do this in my introduction, then I give my thesis what's called exigency or urgency, or I show why my ideas are important. I answer the so what. Okay, so if I'm looking at Robert Frost's poem, "The Road Less Traveled," which probably most of you have at least heard parts of. And everybody talks about how this poem is about taking the path that not everybody is on. Well, what I would do in my introduction is I would kind of explain that common reading. But then I would problematize that common reading somewhere before my thesis. And I would say something like this. However, Frost does not actually tell us what kind of difference taking the road less traveled made for his life. Right? It just says, and that has made all the difference at the end. We don't know what kind of difference, if it's positive or negative. So if I add in that as a problem, that can set up my thesis if I'm going to make an argument, say that the narrator or the speaker in The Road Less Traveled is actually regretting his decision, right? If I want to make a thesis like that. So you see how we construct our argument, or we set up our argument so that the reader understands why it is important and why it is a unique or a needed argument. And so I'll show you that in the example paper here in a little bit, but that's kind of the philosophy behind constructing an introduction. Oops. Okay, so I have this picture from Jaws because what happens is here on the right where you see this fishing vessel, that needs to be kind of the first part of your introduction. The people don't notice the giant shark yet. You can see how casually they're just talking with each other. That's kind of how you want to picture the first part of your introduction. The problem here is that when you introduce the shark, right? And you can signal this grammatically with a word like however or but, or you can literally say, the problem with this interpretation is that blah, 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 blah. And then the thesis would be, what are we going to do with the shark? Okay, so that's just kind of my film metaphor there. Okay, a word about hooks or attention-getting devices or preludes or however you may have heard them described before in your past experience. They should be working with the rest of your intro to create motivation. So there's a couple of strategies I have for you here. an interesting fact or a statistic, so you give some historical background. Some of you did this in your intro paragraphs in Essay 1. You could give some biographical info on the author, you know, some interesting statistic about the work itself. So that's one strategy. Another strategy would be an anecdote, which is a short narrative of an interesting, amusing, or biographical nature. This could be an anecdote from the actual work of literature as well, or it could just be some other kind of anecdote. Another strategy is called an epigraph, and I'm hoping you can see this. I know I have a little webcam here in the middle, but this PowerPoint is on Canvas under helpful resources. An epigraph is an opening quote. It should tie into the shared context in some way. Remember, the shared context is like the people on the boat ignoring the shark. Then you can close read the opening quote immediately afterwards. Now, epigraphs have a special way that you format them. And so you can watch my formatting video. I know it's super exciting, but I do have an epigraph there. And so I show you how you're supposed to format them. And then another strategy for a hook is a puzzling situation. So you could pose a rhetorical question. Please use moderation for those and make sure you always answer them. You could present a dilemma from the text, etc. Okay. You're not going to use all of those. You're going to choose one. Okay, things not to do. What I like to call the dawn of time introductions. Like, poets have always written about love. Okay. Right, we know that. So you don't want to throw away any space, any real estate in this paper, because you'll have a lot that you need to do in a short amount of space. Okay, book report introductions like Elizabeth I was the second living child of Henry VIII. We want to avoid that. We want to avoid dictionary definitions like Webster's defines love as, etc. So those are some things not to do with your hooks. Your hook should be around 2 to 4 sentences tops. Do not angst over your hook. If you can't think of a good one, start with a shared context instead, and perhaps one will come to you. Okay, let's talk about the shared context. Again, this is all part of the introduction paragraph. You want to make sure you tell the reader what work you'll be analyzing, and by cite I mean just tell me the title and the author and even the approximate date. Sometimes I've had students that did not mention what they were analyzing until the thesis, and that can be very, very disrupting and very, very disorienting for a reader, because you're building this world here with your intro, and then you throw in, and I'm going to analyze this, and here's my argument about its meaning there at the very end. And that can be really hard for the reader to kind of follow you through the process of your argument. You can do some summary here in the shared context. That's always good. Do not reveal your thesis yet, though. You can give the surface reading or an alternative reading of the text that you will be arguing against. So in my Robert Frost example, when I said the road less traveled, in the shared context portion, if my argument is that actually the speaker is regretting taking the road less traveled, what you would do here in the shared context portion would be to talk about how this poem is about taking a different path and not being like everyone else, and kind of talk about it in positive language there without revealing that you're going to undermine that in a minute with your thesis. A rough estimate of this portion of your paper is 2 to 4 sentences long. Okay, when you give the problem or introduce the shark, you're going to signal to your reader that you will be offering a deeper or an alternative insight. And I talked about signaling the beginning of this section grammatically with something like however, or although X, Y, X and Y being like placeholders for, arguments, the word but, the problem with this interpretation, any kind of really, really obvious signal. You may feel cheesy doing it, but it is super helpful for the reader, okay? And remember, you're writing for the reader in American academic style because the reader cannot see inside your head. And also the reader should not have to do too much work here. So you want to be very, very obvious when you're signaling. Your thesis. All right. An academic paper can have a thesis that is between 1 and 3 sentences in length. So if you have a really complex idea, you might want to split that idea into 2 separate sentences because you want to go for clarity over cramming stuff into 1 sentence. The thesis should not be the first time the readers hear about your work. Again, like don't save the thesis until, to introduce which work you're going to be analyzing. And you want to be specific, arguable, and reasonable. So no space alien theories, no Shakespeare didn't write Hamlet theories in your thesis. But you can go out on a limb and make an alternative interpretation as long as you can prove it with words, with close reading from the text, then that's just fine. Okay, in the body paragraphs, what you'll be doing is you'll be arguing that thesis a little bit at a time. You have to prove each part of it. You're going to use topic sentences that have something to do with your thesis, that argue a little piece of it, that set up the reader. We want to keep any kind of direct quotes out of topic sentences, but we want to put them in the guts of those body paragraphs for sure. When you get to the conclusion, this is another place where students often don't know what to do. You have been told in the past probably to restate your thesis and the main points of your argument. This is still something you want to do. However, you don't want to stop there. You want to show the broader significance of your argument. And there are several ways you can do this. You can have some further interpretation. Did you have some analysis that you didn't do all the way? In my sample paper, I talk about a character in Twelfth Night named Orsino and how he's still showing some Petrarchan tendencies, which the play is typically fighting, even after he's supposedly cured of his love sickness, his love melancholia. Okay, so I can make it just like an additional interpretation in my conclusion. Another option is to make a connection with another work of literature. For example, we're reading lots of epics this semester. If you are going to write about one of those epics for your essay number 2, bring in one of those. I mean, some of you have been reading your Ramayana discussion post just recently, and some of you are making comparisons between Rama and Gilgamesh, or you might make a comparison between Rama and Achilles, for example. Well, Rama is almost perfect, right? He's such a good son. He's such a good subject to his father, the king. He's a good husband. He's a good everything, right? Whereas Achilles and Gilgamesh, they have some flaws. So what does that mean? Like, what are the implications? So you can compare that a little bit. What is the culture valuing, or what is the culture's kind of perception of humanity? Okay. Another option you can do in the conclusion is to do a counter argument. So what's another common reading of this text that you deviate from? Give that view. If you do that, make sure you refute it. Okay, so if I was doing my Road Less Traveled paper and I wanted to argue that Frost is actually, the narrator in the poem is actually regretting his decision, then I would come back maybe in the conclusion and argue the other side a little bit, but I would still refute it. At the end of your conclusion, a very elegant thing to do is to engage in a maneuver called the snake bites the tail. So go back to your hook and rework that hook in your conclusion, because now you have argued all the way through your paper. Okay, probably some of this I already talked about, because for some strange reason I did not put this in order. So I'm just going to kind of show you, or just kind of skim through these. Again, this PowerPoint is on Canvas for your benefit. So topic sentences reveal which part of the thesis you will be arguing in that body paragraph. You want to incorporate primary source quotations and close reading. You want to use secondary sources to back up your own interpretation or to give historical context. Do not end the paragraph on a quote or begin the paragraph on a quote. We never want to leave the reader to make her own decisions about what the quote means. We always want to be telling the reader what to think. This sounds manipulative, but that's American academic style. Okay? In some cultures, it is considered kind of insulting to tell the reader what to think, but American academic style is very direct, and so that's what you need to be doing at all times. Okay, I am going to exit out of this, and I'm going to go back to Canvas and just talk you through some of the issues for this particular paper. Okay, I'm going to go on student view here so that you're not seeing, I mean, there's no secrets here, but just so that you can find things just like I have. Okay, well, where's my student view? Well, it's not giving it to me. Okay, well, let's just pretend I'm on student view. On the modules page, there's not a whole lot that you normally can't see. Okay. If you're worried about plagiarism, by the way, here is my plagiarism lecture. I use music to kind of illustrate my points. Normally, if you're worried about it, you're not going to commit it. You can always reach out and talk to me about it. Okay, major assignment instructions. The second essay is a critical analysis using research. Okay, it is due Wednesday, January 6th at 11:59. Okay, you can choose one of the readings that we've done from the textbook for this unit. I highly, highly recommend you go back to one of your discussion posts and use that to build your essay off of. You will already have done some thinking about it, and you can definitely expand. You can also see what people commented or what I commented, because that will help you see like alternating interpretations and also places where you may need to bolster your argument a little bit more. Okay, besides the primary source, you need to use one credible academic source in this paper. You could use the textbook. You could use, they give you some background information. You could use an article from the library databases. Here's a link on how to find those. Now, some of you may be very good at using library databases to research things like climate change or, racism in healthcare delivery. You can use them for literary papers as well. Okay, some of the really good databases to use would be JSTOR or Project Muse. Those are probably the two best. If you are visiting us from another university, feel free to use your own university's library kind of interface. I'll be honest with you, having worked at SMU and at UTD, both of those universities were a little bit easier. Their library system was a little bit easier to navigate than Collins. So I'm not going to lie. So if you are, again, taking classes at Collins to support your work at a four-year university, I just want to throw that out there. Okay, I'm not offended. Probably those places have a little bit more money to spend on library infrastructure than Collins does. Here's the steps for the assignment. And then additional requirements. This one is supposed to be 1,000 to 1,500 words. That does not include the works cited or the heading. Just to give you a visual, 1,000 words is about 3 full pages and on to a fourth. 1,500 words is about 5 full pages and perhaps on to a sixth, depending on how long your words are and how much quoting that you've been doing. So please just keep that in mind. Here is a link here under additional requirements and checklist. Here's a link to a formatting video that I made. If you got some comments on formatting on your essay 1, you might want to watch this. Okay, and it's just all kinds of requirements there. All right, there's also some sample papers for you. I had one for the first assignment, close reading essay sample here, and here's a sample research literary analysis or critical analysis with research. Now, this one is one that I use for when I teach classes that are a little bit longer, and so I make them use more sources. So this one's going to have a lot of sources, so just keep that in mind. You do not need to have that many. Okay, this is about Twelfth Night. You see that I have a specific title. Now, I like to be cutesy and do some alliteration. You don't need to be cutesy. You just need to be specific. You see that I have an epigraph here. That's what this is. And then I use that as my hook. And then I immediately start to discuss the epigraph in the first few lines of the intro. All right, and you'll see I'm talking about something called the melancholic or the lovesick character. I talk about how it's common in Renaissance writing. And then right here where I say, although, this is where I start my problematizing. Although modern audiences may be surprised by Orsino's proposal immediately upon learning that Cesario was a woman, Shakespeare has been setting up this marriage to be a success from their first encounter. Okay? And then I kind of riff on that for a little bit, and then I give my thesis. Violet's cross-dressing allows her to become Orsino's true friend. And thus, in Twelfth Night, Shakespeare argues that if love is going to be fulfilling, lovers must abandon Petrarchan love melancholia and create the kind of passionate friendship with their potential spouse that Renaissance men enjoyed with each other. So that's my thesis. It's pretty long. I'll be honest with you. I could have divided that sentence and it would have been fine. Now, let's look at the things I need to prove here. I need to prove that Petrarchan love melancholia is not something Shakespeare is advocating for. Then I need to talk about passionate friendship with fellow men, and then I need to talk about how that translates into a spousal relationship. Okay, so you'll see that I have a topic sentence for this first body paragraph. Twelfth Night demonstrates that Petrarchan idealism is harmful and should be abandoned in favor of friendship. Okay, and then I start to prove my point. You'll see that if I have a quote longer than 2 lines of poetry, then I need to block quote it. Again, that's in the formatting video if you need help with that. Then I close read it. Here you'll see that I'm using secondary sources as well. Orsino's love melancholy is essentially sterile and self-induced, a state of mind dependent upon that very absence and lack of response from Olivia which it affects to lament. Okay, and then I have my in-text citation. So I'm using both close reading and also secondary sources here to bolster my own point. Now, you do not have to do this. I was doing a play and I was talking about how Shakespeare is hinting at a possible romance between Orsino and Cesario / Viola. Cesario is her persona that she puts on when she's cross-dressing, that he's hinting at it earlier in the play. And there's a very famous scene, Act 2, Scene 4, where you really see this. And I'm showing stills from 2 different productions of the play just to show how that's happening there. Now, you don't need to use visuals, but if for some reason you decide to, this is how you would do it. You put them in, you give them a caption, and you close read the visual. Okay. I just want to point out, sorry, I hope I'm not making you car sick, that again, my topic sentence is going to relate to the thesis in some way. Shakespeare juxtaposes Orsino's lack of romantic success and love melancholia against his blossoming friendship with his page Cesario, thus revealing that, for the Duke, male friendships bring more emotional closeness than heterosexual romance. Okay. Then I go on to my next body paragraph. I'm still going to make a thesis reference in my topic sentence. These passionate male friendships must contain an inequality of sorts between friends, a feature that Shakespeare employs in Twelfth Night to create emotional dependence and desire. So I'm still talking about this idea of male friendship. Again, you'll see that I'm using secondary sources and the primary source here when I'm discussing things to prove my point, and I'm not beginning or ending my paragraphs on quotes. Again, I'm still in the body paragraphs where I'm arguing my thesis, where I'm proving my thesis. So again, here on page 5, I am going to make a thesis reference in my topic sentence. Given the depth of male friendship in the time period and in the play itself, it is only by cross-dressing as a boy that Viola can acquire the kind of emotional closeness with the object of her desire, the Duke. Okay. All right. Same thing in this paragraph. Now, my summer class, this is from my summer class, they had to write a longer paper than you. So yours does not need to be this long. Then I have my conclusion here on page 7 into 8. Orsino's Petrarchan condition may be improving, but he is not yet totally cured. Okay, so I talked to you guys about this. This is a way, a kind of technique you can use in your conclusion is to continue the analysis. Okay, and I talk about that. But then I say, you know, this is not actually what's happening. You know, this is not the main theme. Anne Barton has noted if Shakespeare christened a comedy Twelfth Night, it seems reasonable to assume that he intended the title to summon images of Epiphany, as it was kept in his own time period, a period of holiday abandon in which the normal rules and order of life were suspended or else deliberately inverted. Orsino's epiphany is that women can be friends, an epiphany made possible by Viola's Twelfth Night inversion of gender norms. Her carnival disguise allowed her to build amity first before marriage becomes a possibility. This passionate friendship of companions will prove a more stable platform for marriage than the restless, hungry sea of Petrarchan love sickness, which would only consume and not uplift them. Now, what's this restless, hungry sea? Sorry about the scrolling. This is a reference to the sonnet that I started this with. Right? Past cure I am, now reason is past care, and frantic mad with evermore unrest. My thoughts and my discourse as madman's are, at random from the truth, vainly expressed. Okay, so I'm going back to that Petrarchan ideal. I just want to point one more thing out for this paper, and that's the works cited, because some people had some issues with their works cited. Not everyone, but I have all kinds of examples of works cited, kind of sources here. If you're using, so if you go down to Shakespeare here, this is an example of how you would cite a work from an anthology. So this is not the same anthology as you're using, of course, because I'm not just going to write your citations for you. But you see how I give the author, I give, if it's a short poem, then I would put it in quotes. If it was something longer, I would have italicized it like I did for Twelfth Night here. Then I give the name of the anthology, its volume and edition, who the editor was, the publisher, the date, and the page number or page range in this case. Okay. I also have an example of how to cite here in this, several of them, the Lindheim and the Patterson. You'll see how I have an example of how to cite an article that I got from an online database. Okay. I also have some plays here. I don't know if some of you decide to write on Hamlet and want to write about the adaptations of Hamlet. You could do it that way. Okay, so that's all for this message. I know this has gone a little bit longer than I thought. This is not something I'm going to give you a quiz over. The quiz will actually be your essay. So watch this as you need to. Look at those sample papers. See what I'm doing there. That's a template. I mean, obviously, I don't expect you to write the exact same intro as I did, but that's just a template for how you build motivation for a thesis, how you continue to argue that thesis through each body paragraph, and how you extend the argument in a conclusion. You guys have a happy holiday, and I will see you later.